All right, hey, thanks for joining us today. Got Preston and Melody here. I'm Mark. This is the Body Smart Book Club, where we share the best of what we've read. And this week, we're going to be going over Chapter 3, or at least part of Chapter 3. So pages 71 through 96.
We did announce that we were going to do all of Chapter 3, but in getting this video ready, we just realized that that's a lot of information to smash in one video, so we're just going to do the first half up to page 96, and then we'll do the next half next week.
Definitely, yeah. I just want to spread it out. There's just so much good stuff in these chapters that that we want more time to go over those things and to kind of dissect that and digest that a little bit better. So it should be really fun. This is over the methodological basis of endurance training. So kind of the taking the science and how do we apply that to our training. And so the big concepts in here that we're going to talk about is capacity training versus utilization training. And we'll dive into that in just a little bit. But first we wanted to start out with just defining briefly some of the terms that we're going to be talking about. There's definitely some argument in how these terms are defined, exactly what they mean, exactly when they come. But we will talk about them the way kind of that we think about them, the way that we use them. But certainly dive into the book, form your own opinions. But it's really the big part is not so much in being the exact definition, but how we are applying the training to get the maximum benefit out of our different energy systems, kind of like we've talked about in the past. So the first one that we want to talk about is aerobic threshold. And so if we're getting like really very sciencey, and this is the way that the book defines it, its base level is when those lactate levels in the blood rise about 1 millimolar above baseline levels. I know that is pretty much meaningless to everyone that's like not doing blood lactate testing, right? Like what is a millimolar and why do I care about it?
Like your Garmin doesn't measure that.
Yes,
you
it
won't
does
have that on your watch.
little needle like goes in and collects blood.
I think Garmin should get on that.
No, yeah. And I feel like look at my wrist. Why do I have all these red dots on my wrist? Oh yes, lactate.
Lactate. My run.
And so really that is above that lactate, or sorry, not above that lactate threshold, above that aerobic threshold is when that lactate level in the blood starts rising, right? We kind of correlate the lactate level with how quickly we're getting fatigued. It has some good correlation there. But it's a point at which breathing becomes a little bit more labored, at which it's more difficult to hold a conversation. And that's kind of how I like to think of it is I can run at this pace, right? I'm going to be able to run a long time at this pace, and I can hold a pretty steady conversation with another person without having to like, okay, back to the conversation, right? So it's just a pace that can be held for quite a bit, for quite a long amount of time. Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense. So basically, if you can have a conversation, you are below this threshold, and as soon as you can't have a comfortable conversation, you've hit the aerobic threshold.
As a general rule.
Yeah. Obviously, there's a little bit of
That's
wiggle
how
room
we
there
define
between
it.
different numbers. It's going to be different for different level athletes as well. So if you're talking like an elite marathoner, it's going to be close to your marathon pace, whereas like for the average runner out there, it might not quite be there. So in the book, it defines it as being between like 30 and 120 minutes, something you can last for that long in your aerobic threshold. And so for obviously most of us, if not all of us, being able to run a marathon in that amount of time is just not possible. And so being at your aerobic threshold is going to be a little bit slower than your marathon pace.
Definitely. A great way to put that. I like that. Very, very applicable. The next one is going to be our anaerobic threshold. This has a lot of different names. It correlates pretty well with the lactate threshold. There's definitely some differences. We're not going to dive into that. But that is the threshold or the intensity above which the speed, the pace you're going, the amount of work you're going to be doing is only going to be sustainable for 30 seconds up to a couple minutes. It's not a long time, right? Once those levels start to rise so precipitously, right, the body just cannot clear that lactate faster than it's being produced, and that just starts to raise really quickly. And so again, that sends a signal to our brain, and our brain's like, okay, fatigue, right? Let's slow down the pace, so that we kind of that we don't burn ourselves out, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then the lactate threshold is right after that, and that correlates with zone 4, zone 5.
Yep.
Basically, I mean, really similar, right? But now you're just running faster, your body's producing more lactate.
Yeah, right. And so that anaerobic threshold, that lactate threshold are very close to one another. But again, there's some debate on what those terms actually mean, how they're defined. For the purposes of this show, we're going to say that they're pretty synonymous. And again, it's really kind of in that zone 4, zone 5 level. Like, you're not going to be able to sustain that effort for a super long amount of time.
Yeah, your lactic threshold really can only be sustained for 2-3 minutes at the most. Think like running like a half mile on the track or something like that. It's going to be very quick. It's going to mostly be done without oxygen. That's why it can't be maintained for such a long time.
Man, I remember when I first read 80-20, like trying to figure out these terms and like writing down the definitions, and he was like interchanging all of them, and I was like, I don't understand.
So if you look up aerobic threshold
Uh-huh.
on Google, like there's not even a Wikipedia page for it. It actually like brings up anaerobic threshold first, and then if you look into, like, I looked at several blogs and stuff, and just everyone defines it a little bit differently and uses it a little bit differently, and so like it's really tricky to like pin down, which is why I think that like setting things by zones is a lot better than like, am I aerobic or anaerobic? Because if you're staying within certain zones based on like validated like testing, like the cardio coach, then you're gonna, like, if you're training in zone 1, zone 2, right, you're gonna stay in that place where you're building fat adaptation, and then if you're, zones 4, zone 5, you're going to be building that anaerobic capacity, yes, and like getting above that lactate threshold, right? Like that's just built into the training without having to care so much about specific terms. Again, I think the point that we want to get across, agree with us or disagree with us on these definitions. Like I said, there is definitely a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of debate on what exactly each means, where they should be. But I think just having a good idea of kind of what they mean for our bodies and how they fit into the type of training that we're doing. I think ultimately the important thing, and we'll get more into this, is spending time in those training zones that are going to give us more of an aerobic benefit or an anaerobic benefit, and having those put in the right proportions, that we're getting the maximum benefit, right? That we're spending the amount of time necessary in each of those stages to really maximize performance results as a whole.
We're gonna hop into the capacity versus utilization debate. So I'm gonna give just kind of a simple definition of capacity training versus utilization training, and then we'll dive a little bit more into it. So capacity training, to put it simply, it's not sport specific. It takes a long time to build your capacity or your potential to get good. And this kind of training is prioritized in your base training. So it incorporates aerobic training, anaerobic training, strength training, and technical training. And now utilization training is a little bit different, where it is prioritized in the peak phase of training or closer to competition. So it's sport/event specific, and you're going to see gains really, really fast versus capacity training, where it takes a long time before you start to see gains.
Definitely. And so I think it just really, and I really liked how the book put this, is that we can think of capacity training as working on your long-term performance potential, and utilization is focusing on short-term results in performance. And so, like you said, those changes that we associate with capacity training are take a lot longer to develop, but are much longer lived. And so those are some of the things that we've talked about in the past, right? Increased mitochondrial density, increased capillary growth in the muscles, just more better utilization of fat as a fuel source. To build those adaptations and to get those systems running at top level really takes some time. And so, like you said, that's more kind of that base building phase. And that's the really important part is that we build that base. And we've said it again, or we've said it a lot of times, and we're going to say it again. Building that base is so important because it's that base that we build everything off of, right? And you can think of like, you look at the pyramids in Egypt, right? It's not this tiny like 2-foot base and they put everything else on top of it, right? It's these enormous bases that they can build everything all on top of. They can support the weight of that. And that's really what the capacity training does, is it supports the weight of our goals, let's say it, right? It supports the weight of all those race-specific workouts without causing everything to collapse, right? We just have that really big capacity in which to fit everything else.
Yeah, that capacity training is really going to be increasing, just as in the title, the capacity of how much training we can do in that utilization phase. Because obviously our goal is to find out how much training we can do and how much training we can absorb and be able to use within our own training that will make us better. And so the more capacity training we're able to do, the more we're going to be able to do that race-specific, that event-specific stuff in the utilization training. And the more training that we can absorb there, the better athlete we're going to become.
Definitely. I really like the word that you use, to absorb that, right?
Yeah.
That we've really built up a certain amount. We just have a much bigger reserve, right?
Yeah, I mean, because anybody can go out and do or try to do like a hard workout every day and go fast every single day. But how much of that is your body actually going to be able to use? How much of it is it actually going to use to become faster and stronger? And so if you don't have that capacity to be able to handle that workload, it's just going to be a detrimental thing. You're going to be on that slippery slope of just digging yourself deeper and deeper into that fatigue reservoir.
Yeah. So this reminds me of a story that Cameron's talked about several times. It's funny, we're always referencing Cameron. You'll see him
Cameron's
eventually.
one of our partners, yeah. He'll show up in one of these videos.
So he was talking about how when he was in school, they were doing some exercise testing. And, there's this one guy who was a well-trained runner and, went through the test and got this really good VO2 max score, right? Really, really good VO2 max score. Put that in quotes. We've kind of talked about that in previous episodes, some of the limitations of VO2 max. But Cameron was like, I can do that, right? And so he just suffered and ended up getting a pretty similar score to this guy. But he was wiped out. In fact, I think he said he passed out. If not that, he was lying down, just felt sick for the rest of the day. It completely wiped him out. Whereas this other classmate who was a well-trained runner, it was no big thing. It wasn't a big deal because he had that ability to absorb the work and recover quickly. Whereas Cameron in that case, did not absorb that work well, right? It totally just took him out for really the rest of the day. He had trouble walking, right? He just blasted through all of his reserves, which at that point weren't as large.
Yeah. It's really easy to get stuck into that mentality of just wanting to do as much utilization training as you can because like we'd mentioned in previous videos, that sort of training is going to be what's going to give us the biggest benefit right away. You're going to see a lot of rapid gains. But the problem with that is that you get stuck on that training and you start to lose that capacity to be able to handle the work, and that's when you'll see different injuries and things like that.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point there, right? That eventually it just becomes too much for our body systems, right? So, and I think that goes back to how much stress our bodies can handle, can absorb over a certain period of time. Anytime that we're, going on a run, right, there's a certain amount of stress, right? And immediately it's going to fatigue us. But if we approach it right, we'll end up having those adaptations, those really positive adaptations that we want, right? They call it super compensation. But if we just hit that fatigue too much and keep hitting it, our body never makes those adaptations. It's just constantly dealing with a chronic stress response. And eventually, like you said, we see ourselves slow down. We get breakdown, we get injuries. And so as much as those quick gains might be nice to see and really cool, ultimately we shortchange ourselves. And it's one of the unfortunate things that we see in a lot of training, and it's kind of had this up and down over the years. The idea of this polarized training, right, of that more 80% of our time in more low intensity and that 20% high intensity, it's been well proven for a long time that works extremely well, right? With with a lot of research studies and just proven out on the track again and again and again. But there will be some new fad thing. Oh, we got to do this type of training, right? And people will get away from that, and then kind of gets rediscovered, right? Oh boy, like this capacity training, we've got to build that base, and we've got to really work on those things. And then the next fad comes in, and we got to go chase that. And so even though the science is excellent behind more of that polarized training, and behind really focusing, especially in the beginning of our training, on that base building, it isn't necessarily glamorous, right? Like we were talking about earlier, like you were talking about you and Jacob got passed like by the super old lady on the hill. I was running the other day, just going super slow. Like I was decked out in all my running gear, and it's just like, so I'm just over 6 foot and get passed by this, someone who's probably like a foot shorter than me, right? Just like moving along, and I felt like I was just like, like when you're walking in the airport and you're walking regular and someone's on like one of the moving pathways and there's like, like that's what it felt like. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going so slow, right? It didn't feel glamorous, not like, oh man, like I'm killing it, I'm passing all these people. But like ultimately in slowing down, on putting our focus where we should be, that's going to have the best long-term gains, and in terms of recovery, in terms of performance, in terms of overall training effect. Yeah.
I love that you bring up the point that it's not glamorous. I think that's just being a good athlete and being healthy. It's all about coming back to the basics and not following those fads. It's all about just coming back to those basics, and no one wants to come back to the basics because the basics are ugly. And the basics are hard. They're not exciting, but that's what being a good athlete and being healthy is all about. So I'm really glad that you brought up that point.
Yeah. Well, it's so readily available too. You think about like all these different social media platforms that we have, whether it's Strava or Instagram or Facebook, people are always sharing their workouts. Mm-hmm. And it's so visible to everybody. And so it's almost like, I don't want people to see that I went easy today or this or that. But because no one's going to be bragging about like, you won't believe how slow I went today.
It was so slow.
Like no one wants to brag about that.
Well, I totally know this trick because I feel like in our circle, that's what we do. Guess how slow I went. That was good.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up, always running at that aerobic threshold, always running at whatever pace it is. And sometimes you've got to take a step back and really put into perspective, this long-term approach to your training. Your training is never about the next week or the next day. It's always about the next month, the next year, the next 5 years.
Love that.
And so developing that capacity to be able to handle a workload over a long period of time is going to be a lot more beneficial than that too much utilization training. And this is something that's been consistent across all 3 books we've read. There's been a lot of conflicting opinions between different people within this exercise physiology realm. But this is something that, 80-20 running, you need 80% of your training to be the capacity training, 20% to be that utilization. In Primal Endurance, talked about the exact same thing. And then again, it comes up in this book. And so it seems to be this consistent theme, that although there's a lot of things that people disagree on, this is something that's kind of like across the board. Make sure you're building up your base. That's the most important thing. Endurance athletes are not about tomorrow. They're about the next year.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. We really like to take snapshots of people at their best, mm-hmm. and then we're just like, oh man, this isn't their best. Like, so we have to be doing all those things, and then we can be our best too. Not recognizing, like you said, the months and the years that went in getting to that best snapshot. Yeah. One thing that the book talked about, and that we definitely see, right? You see this all the time in news articles, right? Like, oh, this elite athlete does this, and so if you do these things, then you'll be successful too, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they can do those things because they've built up that base, because they've trained the right way for years and years and years, so that they actually get the benefit of those workouts. And so I think that's such a great point, right? Making sure that you're putting in the time and recognizing where your mind has to be and how you have to be approaching everything.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the biggest mistakes they talk about within the book is like, the biggest mistake of an amateur athlete is they're emulating everything that an elite athlete does. And, we're kind of drilled that message our entire lives, like copy what other people have gone before you, other people that are successful do. But in reality, just realize that training is very individualistic, and that what got Kilian Jornet to being, the best in the world is not what's going to be best for you, because there's going to be differences there.
I love that. And I just want to bring a point. I feel like this goes both ways. Don't try to copy someone who's better than you, right? And
Like that.
don't judge someone who's not running as many miles as you, or who's not doing the same kind of training as you, because our bodies are different. You just need to let people do it the way they do it, what's best for their body and where they're at mentally, physically, emotionally in their training.
Yeah. So I love that you mentioned that, right? Focusing on ourselves, not so much on what other people are doing, not trying to fit a specific mold. So one of the athlete's stories just ties in super well with that. It was Ricky Gates, and he was talking about how early in his running career, he really wanted to get on, I think it was the University of Colorado, it was some
Just
track
a
team for
highly
Colorado.
competitive cross-country team.
And so for, I think it sounds like it was like the 3 years of undergrad, he just was like always looking at his watch, right? Like he's pretty much always training, right? Oh, I gotta be this pace. And just trying to meet the elite athletes. And so every time the track season would roll around, right? Kind of running against their times, and found himself always falling short.
And he never made that cross-country team. He tried out every year and never made it.
Yeah. And so just like, it was so frustrating for him initially, right? Like, oh, this is what I want to be. And then he recognized like, that's not me. Like, and I'm okay with that. Found his way into trail and mountain running, and kind of into the lifestyle of that whole thing, and actually ended up winning one of the years. It was the mountain running championship, the U.S. mountain running championship, and the U.S. trail running championship, right? So someone who had trained for years to to kind of meet this other standard, the standard of other people who are elite, right? Wanting to be just as great as them, and finding that for him, for his personality, for his body, for his genetics, right? That wasn't the goal that he ultimately wanted to chase. But that mountain running, that trail running became a lifestyle for him, something that he really enjoyed, something that really meshed with who he was. And he ended up being very successful in that area, and it just kind of opened up a whole new world and a whole new lifestyle to him. And so I think that idea of fitting ourselves to other people's standards or the best in other people's really isn't the question we should be asking ourselves. It's how do we develop our capacities, how do we develop our talents into being the best version of ourselves, and being able to share that with the world instead of some perfect example of who we're quote unquote supposed to be.
Yeah, I think this story is a perfect example of passion. And I feel like what he was passionate about, he just so happened to be built for that, which got him really, really good. But even if you're not genetically built to do something you're passionate about, I feel like you can get good at whatever you're passionate about, and you should do what you're passionate about. Because what's the point of doing any of this? What's the point of being an athlete if you don't love it, if you don't enjoy it?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on that, because like this is very much a lifestyle for you.
It is. And that's like balance that a lot of elite athletes have issues with. Their sport that had become like this escape, this thing that was like such a passion of their lives, then all of a sudden becomes like a job for them, because now they're representing a brand or this or that, and so that can be kind of a tough balance. But when it comes down to it, it all comes back to the fact that you love what you're doing. Being an elite athlete and being a professional athlete is kind of this thing that people view as super glamorous, but what makes it any different than any other job if you don't like what you're doing? Mm-hmm. If ultimately, like, you're a professional basketball player and you go and you're traveling and playing basketball, but if you hate playing basketball, like, why is that any better than doing just a random job that, so-and-so also didn't like? It's going to be just as miserable. And so I feel like as long as you have that love for what you're doing, then it's going to be easier to enjoy the journey and not focus so much on, where's my training taking me? What are the results of this? It's more, I'm doing this because I love it. I get out there every morning and I run. And while the rewards in running well is kind of like a secondary thing, I always have to fall back on the fact that like I'm enjoying what I'm doing, and I don't have to look back with regret thinking like, what did I do with all that time? Like I spent 4 hours a day out training, and like I could have been progressing in this way or this way or this way. Instead, it's like, I lived a great life because I was happy doing all these different things, and it wasn't 100% focused on the results.
I love that. And I think ultimately, if you're passionate about it, you're just going to be better at it, because the love for it is going to be the motivation that's going to keep pulling you forward. If the motivation is awards and recognition, that's not going to be enough to keep pulling you forward and taking you to become the best that you can be.
Yeah, and I love that word, right? Become, right? You mentioned as well, right? It's so much about that journey versus some of those secondary results. And so I think just that idea of becoming and focusing on the reward of becoming, and like taking that with everything, right? I think it's really easy to focus on those secondary things, right? I won this race and I podiumed here and I did this and this. And then to kind of diminish, but man, I really didn't do well there and I messed up here. And boy, I made these mistakes, right? I think we never talk about that. What are the mistakes that I made? Where are the things that like weren't always peachy keen, that didn't go perfect? Peachy keen, I know, right? I am from 1950. But really, it's part of the journey, right? And much like running in the mountains, right? We're pulling out some analogy, right? There's definitely more challenging parts of the trail. There's up and down. One of the athletes mentioned in one of their initial bouts of mountain running that they had to like swim through an icy river, right? So some really uncomfortable times, but ultimately things that built them. And so really, I guess having that mindset of let's recognize the good and the bad, and recognize that it's all part of the journey, and that rather than failures or mistakes defining us or saying who we are, being able to see them as stepping stones to new experiences, to new growth, to helping other people with some of their challenges. And so I love that. I love the message of becoming. I love the message of our training, of our passions being a journey. And learning all those lessons and finding that growth on the way.
It kind of ties back into another one of the athlete stories that was mentioned here by Dakota Jones. She was another athlete that's, it talks about her first experience being out in the mountains, and, she was out there and on this ridge, and she was out there for like 18 hours for this first day, and she said that it was very challenging. There were times she was really discouraged, but when she finished, she looked back, she's like, man, like I had this euphoric feeling of like, man, like I can't believe what I just did today. That's so cool. And she fell in love with this idea of being out and exploring and being on these adventures, enough so that she's like, I want to be really good at this. I want to keep training for it. And she said that over time, our training started adapting, and instead of like being up in the mountains, it was doing this like specific training in the gym where she was just walking up a treadmill on an incline to replicate climbing up a mountain, and she was doing lots of lifting and lots of just things you could replicate within a gym for that mountain training. And at one point, she had mentioned she looked back and was kind of dismayed. She's like, how did I get here? Like, I fell in love with being in the mountains and training in the mountains, and now all of a sudden I am in the mountains like very rarely. I'm in the gym all the time, and this isn't what I fell in love with. Like, why am I here? And so it talks about how she was able to get back to her passions and able to get back to the mountains, and kind of transition to back what she loved. And she was able to regain that passion, that fire to keep training and keep going.
I loved this story. She said at the very end of her story, she said, at the end of the day, the point is to have a good time. So I just think that's awesome. Another thing that I want to bring up with her story is when she did start to transition to more gym, less mountains, she said she got really caught up in the times and doing really good and competing, and she pushed herself too hard, and she had injury after injury after injury. And then she couldn't do what she loved. So she had to take a step back and think about what she was doing, adjust her training, and be okay with slowing down so she could go do what she loves. So the lesson there is to just not get caught up in pushing yourself. It's okay to come back to the ugly basics, right? So you can take care of yourself and so you can keep doing what you love to do for the rest of your life instead of being one of those athletes that goes 120% for 5 or 6 years, you break your body and then you can never do it again. So take care of yourself.
No, such a great story. Another thing that I really wanted to point out is that Dakota is actually a man, not a woman. Oh my gosh. Just thought we should define that, you know, while we're defining terms.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dakota.
Yeah, I feel bad now.
But you have some great stories, so
Yeah.
lessons learned
Dakota,
for sure.
you're awesome. Thanks, Mark, for pointing that out to us.
Yeah.
But anyways, it's a great story. Well, we do this podcast to teach you guys science, and we always end up talking about our feelings. It's like turned into
Feelings
like
hour.
sports psychology
Right, there you go.
podcast. Can you tell what we're passionate about? Well, I mean, I guess we're passionate about the science too.
Yeah.
Anyways.
I've actually got to run today, but Cameron and Melody will still get into some of the questions.
And Preston.
And Preston.
Yeah.
Also, I say Cameron. I looked at you.
Yeah.
I looked at you, and I said Cameron. It's been a good
Cool.
episode. It's been fun today, so I'm gonna skedaddle.
Okay.
Peach
Okay.
King.
Thanks, Mark.
Karen, hey!
All right, hey. Now what?